Welcome to the SOAS Deaf Track podcast series. The Deaf Track podcast series offers episodes covering critical conversations in international development with academics, researchers, and practitioners. In this episode, entitled Afghanistan in Archives, we, a group of students and researchers at SOAS, would like to examine various issues surrounding archives and their exploration. Like most countries plagued by political instability, Afghanistan has gone through episodes of conflict and state collapse that appear in the archives, but that also impact archiving and access to archives. These archives play a key role in research on Afghanistan and its people, and contribute to shaping our understanding of nationalism, identity, and the state, historically and in the present day. Archives in Afghanistan are far less accessible since August 2021, and so researchers may feel an added responsibility to document and preserve their content, especially personal collections that are susceptible to being forgotten, dispersed, or destroyed. As it were, the vulnerability of archives in Afghanistan created the conditions for robust archiving techniques and digitization that are now being implemented more widely in a post-COVID world. I'm especially interested in what archives about Afghanistan represent to different communities today. What actions or ideas do they enable? How do we begin to explore their potential? Zeynep Tuba Sungur is a postdoctoral researcher at SOAS, researching the idea of nationhood in Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. She received her doctorate from the Middle East Technical University in Turkey, specializing on modernization and nation building through education in Afghanistan. Zeynep, what time period does your research cover? What kind of material do you look at?
Yes, Florence. During my PhD research, I worked on the school textbooks that were at use during the lifetime of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, that is approximately the last 2 decades. So these textbooks were written by textbook writers employed at the Ministry of Education, which means that they were the products of the state at that time. So in particular, I studied the textbooks of social studies, civic education, history, and patriotism that were used at the first 9 years of compulsory education.
Thank you, Zainab. Barry Sadid is a British-Afghan journalist working at BBC Monitoring on the Middle East team and is completing a master's in history at SOAS. His work focuses on early 20th century radicalism in Afghanistan and the contemporary practice of oral history in the diaspora. Barry, you look at the corpus of a particular individual and its context. Please tell us about that.
So currently, as part of my academic work, I'm writing a biography of the early 20th century radical Sarajevo. And the period of that is basically his lifespan and the kind of the afterlife of his generations that followed him. So it's about from the beginning of the 20th century to about the 1980s, but he himself died in 1960. And to write this biography, I'm having to draw on a number of public and private archives, more so private, and both drawing on oral and textual archives. In terms of the public, there's newspaper archives, but the public record is quite limited because the story of Sarajevo is tied up with also his persecution and the government barring him. He was a journalist and a writer, and his story is he spent a third of his latter life in prison and basically barred from publishing anything in text. And so in writing his biography, I've had to draw more on private texts from his private family archives, like his prison notebooks, but also oral history, so kind of gathering accounts and stories from his family members and basically the descendants of his comrades, because none of his comrades are living.
Thank you, Barry. And now Bismillah Alizadeh is a PhD candidate at SOAS. His research focuses on demands for decentralization among the Hazara political elite in Afghanistan. Bismillah, you're presently in the thick of research. How do you go about building an archive relevant to your topic?
So I think there are 3 things to mention here. One is the biographies and autobiographies of Hazara politicians from the 20th century, particularly from the 1960s onward. Another is the newspapers and other periodic publications from various episodes in the 20th century. And a third one is interviews with Hazara politicians. So I'm collecting all of these to be used for my research primarily, but then also kept with me for future use.
Thank you, Bismillah. Finally, I'm Florence Shahabi, a Canadian Afghan researcher writing a biography of the Afghan poet-philosopher Bahauddin Majru. I'm also researching the history of an archive dating back to the 1960s related to the Linguistic Atlas of Afghanistan, and I'll share more about that later. So I'd like to open the discussion by asking a few questions to learn more about the archives that you all work on, as well as your thoughts on archives about Afghanistan more broadly. First, and perhaps Barry, you can address this, how are various communities and peoples of Afghanistan represented in archives about the country? What about ethnic, religious, and cultural diversities? What have you found in your work?
It's an interesting question. I think when we talk about the classic archives, we're talking about the kind of the documentary collected archives that historians draw on. And just from kind of a cursory look at the endnotes of any historian working on Afghanistan, it's kind of dominated by what's been produced by the court, the embassy, basically those across Afghan history have access to either scribes or the printing press. And what we have is basically historical texts kind of radiating from these, what we can call kind of sites of power. And in terms of who's excluded from this, the vast majority of Afghanistan's population for most of Afghan history have been non-literate. But that's not to say that they didn't have their own kind of means of transmitting information, or that they were completely shut out from information networks in the country. It's just that what we've inherited is really kind of quite diminished. And I think our task as historians is kind of trying to evade what we see, the hierarchy that we see, and the political histories that have been fed to us. So we know all about the kind of the infighting of the court, but we wouldn't know so much about really kind of underwritten events in Afghan history. And oftentimes we find that it's actually we have to rely more on non-Afghan sources, NGO archives, foreign governments archives, like Jonathan Lee drew on for his account of Abdul Rahman Khan's campaigns in the north. Yeah, so it's not just about the kind of ethnic communities, but it's about kind of the rural-urban divide, who had access to kind of almost literacy and producing documents, things that could last versus who couldn't. And in my work, what I found is kind of there's been an interesting mixture of that, because Sarwar Joya was from an elite Qizilbash family. He himself was a Mirza and kind of worked as a secretary, a munshi in the court of Amnullah Khan. And he brought one of the first original printing presses to Afghanistan in Herat. But at the same time, because of him falling foul of the government through criticizing them publicly, he was also kind of in part wiped out from this public record. And in the same way that we have to use oral history to kind of recover histories of gender, of ethnic communities, the rural or the non-literate, I've had to use oral history to kind of flesh out those areas of his life that have been basically not expunged from the public record, but not allowed to enter the public record in the first place.
Thank you, Barry. Zainab, could you tell us more about how identity and nation building are represented within archives? What do archives tell us about the relationship between peoples and the state? And this really builds on what Barry has been telling us about the nature of what's been kept in written archives versus what remains in the oral archive or oral tradition.
Yes, sure. So to understand all these issues better, I examined the idea of nation specifically, or millat, that was being constructed in the textbooks and presented to students. So my findings revealed a local conceptualization very different from the Western idea of a modern nation that is made up of individual citizens. So according to this conceptualization, the Milleti Afghanistan, or nation of Afghanistan, has four major elements. First, Islam. Second, Watan or homeland. Third, Qawm or Aqwam in plural, or which may be translated as ethnic groups, communities, or tribes. And four, Afghaniyat or Afghanness. In this conceptualization, the nation consists of Qawms or communities, especially those 14 ones listed in the constitution. This reveals a group-based understanding of nation instead of an individual, citizen-based one. And Islam is described as the top commonality among the Qawms, bringing them together on the basis of Islamic brotherhood. And these communities live in the homeland of Afghanistan, which is presented as an Islamic homeland that needs to be defended with jihad against the enemies. And here, what is defended is not the territorial homeland, though, but the religion of Islam. And besides all these elements, the idea of Afghanness comes up as the weakest element, probably due to the controversy around the ethnonym Afghan. To ease the tension, the textbooks explain that being an Afghan means basically two things: being a religious Muslim and having a Qawm identity. So as you can see in this picture, this locally conceptualized idea of nation is very different from the one intended by the actors of the Western liberal project in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Zainab. That's really interesting. I think both of you, Barry and Zainab, have begun to touch upon what the accessibility of archives means for our understanding of them as historians. Could you tell us a bit more about your process, how you've accessed these archives, what their medium means to you, or how you've managed to make them more accessible through your work, or if you are working at all on doing that, and perhaps why, if you could share that?
Going back to my work writing a biography of Sarwar Joya and kind of accessing the different archives, it's not been so much easier when it comes to accessing the public archives versus the private. And I think we're all working in this kind of war-struck context if you're part of the diaspora, where especially if those public archives are located in Afghanistan in the first place, like the archives of the Ittifaq Islam newspaper that Joyal wrote for that he was editor of in Herat in the 1920s. It's kind of each archive poses its different challenges. For me, it's been actually the easiest archive to access personally. It has been Joy's private archives because his so Sarwar Joy is also my mum's uncle, and I've been able to kind of pull on the tree of those kind of like familial connections to meet relatives I've never seen before in my life. But because of this kind of familial blood connection, I've been able to gain their trust. And in terms of what the main kind of body of text I've been working on from Joy's life is actually his prison notebooks. So while he spent about the last 24 years of his life on and off in prison in Demazang until he was executed privately in 1960. And over that time, he produced hundreds and hundreds of these prison notebooks. He himself was him and his fellow comrades in prison almost turned the prison to a kind of university. They teach each other. One would teach English, the other Arabic, the other Russian. They're very much committed to this Enlightenment idea of kind of sharing knowledge and bettering themselves, even though they were condemned to indefinite sentences in prison. And out of that came hundreds and hundreds of notebooks that were smuggled out by his family. But because of the war, migration, and just kind of attrition, what survived is basically 7 or 8 notebooks in the hands of his grandson, which is all the way in Hawaii on the island of Maui, which is literally the other side of the world from Afghanistan. And that's not really unique, I think, for anyone kind of trying to write. I think you probably found the same, Florence, when it comes to writing this kind of like in the context of Afghanistan, you have to kind of cross almost these geographical barriers because of the diaspora being so scattered in the first place.
Zainab, you started telling us about the state textbooks. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I studied, as I told before, in detail these textbooks to observe all these ideas of national identity and nation building. But the first thing that I should emphasize at this point is that the school textbooks actually do not exist independently of the society in which they are produced. This is also true for Afghanistan. And the idea of nation that I just explained is actually a good reflection of the sociology of Afghanistan in general, which we know that it has historically a weak state tradition. And here I'm not talking about the government or those people in power, but rather the state as an impersonal institution and its individual members or the citizens. And this is actually what we do not see in the textbooks. I mean, even the textbooks of civic education do not define or clearly explain what a citizen means. In other words, the citizen conceptually doesn't exist in these textbooks. So it turns out to be something like civic education without citizens. And this irony, I think, stands like one of the many proofs of how the Western liberal project failed in Afghanistan. Because in a country which is neither urban nor industrial nor fully literate, it is hard to institutionalize citizenship in a couple of years just with the help of foreign aid.
Bisma, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what you're finding in your work on this particular topic. Perhaps what has pointed towards the reasons for the failure of the Western liberal project.
Florence, just before answering that question, I would like to add 1 or 2 sentences on what Zainab just raised, which is that these textbooks have all been either in Persian or in Pashto, and that's very important because for quite a long time in the 20th century, various people, politicians and non-politicians from the intelligentsia, they've been demanding textbooks in the local languages in various places in Afghanistan, particularly among the Pashtuns, among the Baluchs, among the Uzbeks, and among others. This has been for quite a long time. This has been a very important demand for the struggles of these communities at the national level. This has not come true really until very recently under Karzai and later under Ashraf Ghani. Some of the textbooks were in Nuristani language, in Uzbeki language, in Pashto language, in Baluchi language, but these were distributed in high schools, not really in high schools, all of them, some of them in primary schools, some of them in secondary schools, and very limited number of them in high schools. But generally, it has been very much limited in terms of act and distribution in schools. So that's also very important when it comes to the idea of nation and nationalism, which is that one particular or 2 particular languages have always been emphasized so much. And now coming to your question, the archives actually reveal 2 things. One is the absence of the voices of various other communities who've been at the periphery of the society in Afghanistan. That's one. And another is also that there is a strong voice in terms of how the idea of nation and nationalism and the idea of power relations in the country has been constructed by the colonial powers with regards to the country in Afghanistan and the state and ethnic groups.
The archives do reveal something about the history of colonialism in Afghanistan, despite the fact that there wasn't outright colonialism. Perhaps you can comment on that, Bismillah.
So I think one is the colonial knowledge about Afghanistan and about the relationship between what various ethnic groups that make up the population of Afghanistan. I think that's very important in terms of shaping the particular social and power relations between these different ethnic groups and one particular ethnic group who has been at the helm of power for quite a long time. So colonial knowledge played a very key role in that. But then when we see voices from the periphery, voices from the marginalized communities, various ethnic groups like the Hazaras, like the Uzbeks, like the Qizilbash, like the others, it's important to also think about what value these voices add in terms of diversifying the archives and the collections that are to be made available and preserved, of course, because at the heart of all of these is recognition, which is very, very bold and very much highlighted. It's also the social justice. So many of the Uzbek writers, for instance, and the Hazara writers, in their biographies and in various newspapers and other monthly and weekly and periodical publications that they had, they're voicing demands for social justice, which is very central to the entire struggle for the recognition and for the participation. And it's also about their identity. So many of these ethnic groups, when you read those newspapers, when you read those autobiographies, when you listen to them, to sit for an interview with them, they talk about the local identity or their ethnic identity vis-a-vis the national identity as was sort of like propagated by the state. It's like they trying to highlight that national identity does not capture enough about who they are as an ethnic group and why they as an ethnic group have been less privileged in terms of their political participation, in terms of their access to resources, access to public services and development, and even infrastructure in so many cases, including highways and roads and those things. So I think this is very important because this diversifies a lot the discussions and the topics around what has been going on in the country in the past 30, 40 years, or maybe even in the past 2 decades. So I think that's very important when we think about archiving these different sources and materials.
I think, Bismillah, some of this has come to you by way of oral histories, of interviews. And this sounds like one of the benefits of interviews, being able to highlight those narratives that fall on the fringe of the of dominant archives. Perhaps you all could address this topic a bit more, the benefits and the pitfalls of oral history.
I think so from what we discussed earlier about the kind of the limits of the classic documentary archive, it's knowing Afghan history, knowing the history of a predominantly non-literate population where kind of, say among the Pashtuns, where like the roving bard or the so-called Dum was regarded as a kind of journalist. It's from the outside, oral history really looks like a promising avenue of kind of breaking down those hierarchical barriers around documentary history produced by the court and the embassy and the foreign office and so on, and kind of accessing more private histories of kind of gender, social history, just like, as I'm sure you've seen with Madruh and his own kind of collection of the poetry of Pashtun women and his collection of the Lande poetry of Pashtun women. I'm sure as you've seen with Madruh and his collection of Lande from Pashtun women in Kunar, but also in the refugee camps of Pakistan following the war. But I think when it comes to this kind of oral evidence, it also requires a kind of literary knowledge as well as a historical sense. A lot of these historical poems that have been handed down to us, they're kind of structured by a particular literary pattern. It requires more of a multidisciplinary knowledge from a historian when you're kind of trying to crudely extract historical knowledge from these sources.
I'll just interject there by saying that thank you for pointing out Majruh's work. It's unfortunate there's only a handful of recordings of him anywhere. I was going to mention the Linguistic Atlas and the auditory archive that's associated with that, which is almost completely unexplored. There's quite a rich archive. There were a lot of recordings made and none of it has been examined beyond its very strict, limited linguistic use. So I invite anyone and everyone who's interested to take a look at that archive at the University of Bern. I'm sure we all know of archives left, right, and center that merit more attention. Go ahead, Bismillah, you were going to say a bit more?
Yes, I think in terms of the benefits and pitfalls of archiving, I think there are a few things that need to be highlighted. In terms of benefits, I think number one is preservation, because when it comes to oral history, interviewing people who are still alive, representing a different generation, people who've been going through and experiencing some of the particular experiences and episodes in the history, preservation of these experiences is very much important because it will be sort of in one or the other way rendered inaccessible for other generations if these are not preserved. And the second one is access. As in one or the other way, or maybe privileged to have access to these sources or to be able to have an appointment to sit down with particular people and to speak about these particular experiences, but not maybe everyone is in that particular position that we are. So maybe these can be preserved, these can be made accessible through some archives for the future generations, for other people who might be interested in trying to do research, trying to understand particular periods in history. But it's also about giving voice. One of the very crucial values of oral history is giving voice to the people who do not have, for various reasons, who do not have a lot of textual, who do not have their voices recorded in terms of text in the history, for various reasons that we all know. So giving voice to the communities who've been marginalized, who did not have voices, that's also very important. And another value is adding that human experience to it, like to humanize the entire narrative or to humanize our understanding. Because when you speak with people, when you tap into oral history, it's like you are trying to look at events and look at experiences and look at developments from a human perspective. Like you're dealing with feelings, you're dealing with emotions, you're dealing with all sorts of other humanly experiencing of those particular events in history. And official histories or history books do not have that. They don't display that. So I think that's also very important, a very important added value. But of course, it doesn't go without limitations. One could be that mostly oral history relies on memory, and we know that memory is fallible. There could be inaccuracies about particular issues like dates, like names, like particular things that memory may not help in so many cases. And it's also, the need for triangulation maybe to really to look at it from different perspectives to complement one particular source with other sources. So these limitations will only require that we maybe deal with it more professionally and deal with it more methodologically and try to keep them and use them and preserve them and make them accessible.
Zainab, did you want to add anything?
I can have only this addition to what Bismillah was saying. I completely agree with him because this is what I personally experienced in my research as well. Besides reading the textbooks, I also did some interviews at the Ministry of Education at that time during the Islamic Republic. So it really worked for the good of the data in terms of triangulating the data, because you need to support the documents with your interviews with all these experts and officials who actually produced and wrote these textbooks themselves, because I had the chance to interview some of the writers of these textbooks. And while doing this kind of research, you can see why certain things were written in the textbooks and the underlying ideas, underlying thoughts between those written discourses actually. That's why I think documentary research should be supported with oral research as well.
So Zainab, do you have any thoughts on the future of education in Afghanistan at the moment with the current regime in power?
Yeah, as we all know, education is one of the main fields where a huge change took place since the Taliban took to power again. The ban on female education is a serious issue with long-term consequences, which we will be facing probably. And apart from that, the Taliban regime is also set to change the general curriculum in the near future, which would mean a much bigger change. So the school textbooks that I had studied, can still be found in the official webpage of the Ministry of Education right now. However, when the Taliban regime prints new textbooks, the older textbooks archived there will most probably be deleted. So that means we will be losing data. So for researchers wishing to work on education in Afghanistan, it would be useful now to download and archive those textbooks, the current sets of textbooks, because there are many of them right now. And plus, there may also be some larger institutional efforts in this regard by interested parties, such as textbook research centers.
Thank you, Zainab. Coming back to the topic of access and accessing archives, do we have more thoughts on digitization and the future of the accessibility of these archives?
I think even beyond the question of accessibility, I was really struck by what Bismillah was saying about rescuing memory using oral history. And it's, I think, the broader question and the broader challenge is about building these archives in the first place. I think we're in a unique position now where we're confronting a huge kind of loss of historical memory because Afghanistan not quite stateless, but it's in a we lack kind of institutional memory. What we lack a kind of like a stable state. We're in the diaspora, and what we have is we're confronted by the kind of the disintegration of the older generations, and especially of those generations who hold memories of Afghanistan from before the wars. Oral history is the best means of kind of remedying a lot of the knowledge gaps we have around social history, the history of communities who are either distant from the state or involved in a more confrontational relationship with it. But at the same time, we're also confronted by our own, I don't know what you'd say, diaspora-ness. We're so kind of scattered. And it's really, I think the question of accessibility is linked to this question of how do we build these archives in the first place when it comes to Afghan historians, diaspora Afghan historians working on Afghanistan. How do you begin to link up these efforts outside the kind of the supervisory role of state-backed institutions? We live in a very, very fragmented diaspora in the first place. And accessibility is really about community effort, linking up efforts between communities to provide that broader effort, a broader thrust towards archiving.
Barry, what do you make of generational gaps and the ruptures that are created in knowledge because of generational gaps and other forms of distance?
For the diaspora, I feel it's a very emotional question for a lot of people. There's a lot of members of the diaspora who feel like they weren't educated properly in their mother tongue. A lot of them who feel kind of distant from their own literary traditions. And I think what's unique about being in the diaspora in the first place and like being part of those generations is that it lends itself more naturally to archiving. When we think about archiving, it's not just about the collection of material from the past. You're making a particular kind of value judgment of what you collect. And as soon as you enter the diaspora, you're almost entering history or there's a point at which you're removed from your natural context. So the way that me and you, Florence, for example, would speak Persian, it's kind of like if we spoke to someone from Afghanistan, where they might find that that's inflected with the particular dialect of our parents. Like I know I might use more terms that are more common in the 80s than say Bismillah would use. I might say Bomana Khuda more than he would say Khudafiz.
I've been told that by recent refugees to the UK who tell me that I sound like their grandparents. You know?
We're kind of almost archived in and of ourselves. I think with younger Afghans, because of that poignancy, because of that emotional link, they're almost natural archivists. There are so many people who privately gathered this material, record with their family. But I feel that at the same time, there's a institutional gap between this younger generation of diaspora Afghans and the means, the tools, the education they would need to properly both gather that material, but also make it part of a broader, meaningful. Not obviously, it's privately, it would be meaningful for them, a private archive, but like a broader archive and a linked up effort that would make the experiences of say their family available and accessible to a broader public. I know that my answer focused, I think, maybe a bit too much on the diaspora, but that's from what I've experienced, what I see of the generation question.
Bismillah, can you add to that?
Yes. I think one of the things that's very important right now that I've personally come across, that particularly with the Hazaras, and I think this is also true with other communities and other groups, it is that so many individuals who've been politically or culturally very active in the past 3-4 decades, they have their personal collections. And this is dispersed across the world. Some of them are in Afghanistan, some of them in Pakistan, for instance, some of them in Australia, some of them in Europe, some of them in the UK, and various other locations. And then as Barry was talking about this generational gap, I think there is this generational gap here as well. And it plays a very important role, which is that the second generation of these particular individuals who are in possession of personal archives or personal collections, they are not as much interested in these collections. And they don't really know a lot about what it is that their parents, and in most cases their fathers, are preserving. And in so many cases, when I've been like trying to reach out because the father or because the parents is aging, for instance, they are not so much available, I've been trying to reach out to the children, and they don't know anything about what there is in those collections. And they don't know how someone like me who is interested in those materials can really access. So I think there is so much in terms of content in these various collections, and this needs preservation, and this needs to be made accessible, because these are like very valuable sources for us as researchers, or maybe for newer generations to understand particular episodes in the history of the country. So I think in terms of digitization, as you asked at the beginning, I think that's one way to make all of these accessible and to preserve them, because to it would be very costly and very difficult logistically to preserve all of these different collections that are dispersed across the globe. But digitization could be one way. And digitization could also be important given the fact that people would not have access to places like Afghanistan, for instance, because of political security issues, but also sometimes because of, financial limitations, because traveling would really, it's a privilege to be able to travel, sometimes because of visa issues, like in my case, or maybe also because of financial issues. So digitization is a very viable option for making these sources and collections accessible, but also for their preservation, I think.
Zainab, there's been moments of historical amnesia that perhaps we could now revisit, given this opportunity and this distance that we've gained. Could you speak to that, perhaps?
Yeah, during the Islamic Republic, there was this policy in general in the teaching of history of not teaching the historical periods after the year 1973, which is the coup d'etat of Daoud Khan. So you could see that in the history books, history of Afghanistan ended with that period. And there was nothing else told about the Soviet occupation and the following Mujahideen regime or the Taliban regime, of course, and the US occupation period. So now, as I said, there will be curriculum change. Of course, history will be rewritten by the Taliban in the textbooks probably, and they will shape it in their own way probably. Of course, it's a big change because it involves a social engineering process actually in the long term by shaping the mindset of the students. That's what education is for, basically. I mean, it's a very useful tool of the state in shaping minds at a very young age. So it is considered always important by different regimes. It was the case in Afghanistan before. It was used as a tool by the previous regimes as well. Well, it's hard to say anything about the present situation and the present regime's specific goals on it because we don't really have a clear insight into it. We don't know what kind of a curriculum they will be constructing, let's say. But for researchers working on these issues like us, I don't know. We will keep going back to the archives, I think, to understand how different regimes looked at history and history writing and how it will be reflected into the future. That's all I can say, I think.
Barry, Bismillah, do either of you want to comment on that?
So just to add to what Zainab just mentioned, I think we have the general understanding right now in what direction the Taliban are trying to take the entire school and university curriculum, because they published a very detailed report of their official commission on the assessment of the curriculum that was assigned even before it was assigned as the negotiations was going on in Qatar, in Doha. And they took a year or even longer than a year. They assessed all of the textbooks and then they presented their reports. The report was published in Pashto and Dari. And looking at the critique that they actually provide of the curriculum that was being taught at schools in the past 2 decades, and then their suggestions generally, I think we can have some thoughts about what shape the curriculum would have in the future, which is that it would be very much ideologized, very much ideological content will be injected into the curriculum, and so much of the other aspects or non-religious aspects of these would go away altogether. I think that's one of the things that we can really predict right from now, and that's why it's important to really preserve and archive the sources that we have at the moment, which is the textbooks.
I agree, Bismillah. I would point out, though, that no archive is value-free or judgment-free. So I'll open up the question to project management in general, practical matters. How should we think about funding and cataloging? These are issues that are laden with bias and fool ourselves into thinking there's neutrality and objectivity and some type of scientific process. But those are assumptions that we should question and consider at every step. So I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Perhaps starting with new premises when it comes to archives. How do we go about removing some barriers to archives? A lot of archives in the West are not made by Afghans. They don't really have those considerations at all, or if they do, they're with particular political agendas. How do we think about archives anew, perhaps given this opportunity?
Yeah, it really is such a fraught issue, and I can only really talk about from my position as someone of Afghan origins but working from the West. It's kind of, we do think of archives in the sense of what Zainab referred to earlier as almost part of the nation building project, or what the nation state picks for its archive as pillars of a national identity. And now we're kind of in a situation where we're as disconnected from our state as possible. Afghanistan is in a situation of flux, and we're also scattered in the West and reliant on institutions and basically on handouts. It is a conversation I have with colleagues about the practical questions of funding. I guess there are a few different models. There's relying on institutions and the ebb and flow of grants specific to Afghanistan. I think we saw a bit of an upsurge last year in August, but again, it's not really, we can't actually rely on every time there's a tragedy in Afghanistan for a little bit more cash to come our way. And then there's relying on private individuals, rich Afghans, and their most likely ill-gotten gain, a more difficult but maybe more valuable community model, especially with thinking about community archiving and oral history in that sense. But all these things are open questions, and it's really, for me personally, it's challenges that I'm encountering as well. I'm trying to build currently an archive of memories of childhood from Afghans from before the wars began, from the Saar Revolution, or Saar coup d'etat, however you want to call it, in 1978. But the difficult question is not so much actually recording, but it's about, again, those questions of accessibility, of where do we host this? How do we link up our efforts? There are more people working in this space. How do we link up our efforts and create a broader project to host these memories? And that's definitely not something I could say I have the answer to now. And it's really just a goal, I guess, that we have to work towards as historians on Afghanistan.
Zainab, did you want to say something about how you position yourself with respect to archives and where that could introduce bias and how we can control for that?
So as I was saying, when you start working on textbooks, you actually start with this, you actually accept from the start that you will be researching, as you said, texts that are not value-free. Because, as I said, textbooks are products of the regimes, the states. I mean, especially I'm talking about the textbooks of the compulsory education periods at public schools, which was the first 9 years in Afghanistan during the Islamic Republic. So you know that there is a purpose behind constructing certain discourses in textbooks. So you start with this at the beginning, at the very beginning. Now, as my friends were talking, just this idea has crossed my mind. We can now, as researchers, we can go and do a research on the generations of students that were educated with these textbooks of the Islamic Republic, for example. To what purpose did they work? I mean, what kind of mindsets did the textbooks instill on these students? I think that would be a good effort, which would show us really if ever textbooks have any power of shaping people in the case of Afghanistan, because we know that these textbooks were not used in all the schools across Afghanistan due to logistic problems and other problems. In the first place, the state schools were not present everywhere. We know these realities on the one hand, but on the other, we can still go and search if these textbooks and what kind of people actually, what kind of mindsets these textbooks led to in those students. I think that would be a good exercise for the researchers right now.
I agree, Zainab, and it's certainly something that the diaspora can participate in.
Yeah, sure, because we know that most of the young people, we know that many people fled the Taliban regime right now, that there are no girls' education going on in Afghanistan. That's why many people are outside the country. That's why, the researchers, especially in the diaspora, can get involved in that kind of research.
I think this has been the start of what will hopefully be an ongoing discussion about archives, which will accompany our respective projects going forward. This was the first episode in a 2-part podcast series following our academic workshops on Afghanistan. To join the mailing list and learn about future activities about Afghanistan, drop us a line at soasafgevents, all one word, @gmail.com. The second episode of this series will focus on migration. Thank you to our speakers and you, our listeners. We would like to also thank the SOAS Department of Development Studies.